Firstly, I suppose I could disagree with Deputy O'Quigan that I would commend the Minister for his approach. The reason that we put down proposed amendments is so that they could be considered by the Minister and his department, and I'm very glad that he's come back with a detailed consideration so that we can all see where he stands.
Point of information, Secretary. Point of order. Isn't it the normal procedure that the proposers of the motion speak first to the motion and to the amendment, explain the reason for the amendment first, and that the Minister replies?
Yeah, well, isn't that what Deputy McNamara is doing? He's explaining the reason.
No, he said that the Minister was right to reply first. And
no, sorry, that maybe procedurally that was my mistake. I accept that.
In process here, I was asked to actually respond to the group of amendments by the chairperson. I did that. That isn't to suggest that I'm proposing that we somehow shorten the debate and not get people's feedback. So let's not get overly precious
that's
about
fine.
it.
If the error was on my behalf, I regret that. But just the point is that the Minister can come back in and respond.
No, yeah, absolutely.
That's fine.
All I'm seeking to do is to thank the Minister for his inclusive approach in listening to having considered these amendments before he came here, which is not always the case in ministers and former ministers, and secondly for the inclusive approach which he's showing here. I completely agree with the Minister that not every authorised I completely agree with the Minister that not every authorised officer carrying out inspections should be a vet. It'd be a huge waste of money. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Indeed, any and the great majority of inspections, farmyard visits, can be carried out by a non-vet. It's simply that I think some degree, it may not require a vet to do so, but certainly some degree of training in animal husbandry or veterinary practice, I believe, is required before a person can order the destruction of an animal, which I suppose some of our colleagues, will discuss the rights of animals, but aside from the rights of animals, can in instances be a very, very valuable piece of property to a farmer, an essential piece of property. For example, a pedigree cow, a pedigree bull, in which their whole breeding season is predicated, a racehorse, and for a person without training to be able to go onto a farm, a person with less training than a farmer, with no training whatsoever perhaps, to be able to go onto a farm and order the destruction of a farmyard animal against the wishes of a farmer is something over which I would have, as a farmer, and I declare a conflict of interest in this regard. I am a farmer. I also have some legal training, but I am a farmer. It's in my declaration of interests, and I would have grave reservations about the ability of somebody with no training whatsoever, no animal husbandry training, no veterinary training, to come onto my farm and order me to destroy an animal. If it was honestly, and I accept that they could honestly believe it was required. They could they could believe that it was required to destroy that animal. But if the farmer believed otherwise, then I think that some degree of training or veterinary experience it would be required by a person before they could order the destruction of an animal. And I would urge the Minister to consider how this could be these property rights could be protected. And I completely acknowledge that property rights give way to the common good. I'm not arguing that the proprietary rights of farmers over their farmyard animals should trump everything else, but they should be considered.
To respond to the issues that were raised, just in terms of the actual principle of having a separate function or a separate definition of what vets do versus what authorised officers do. Clearly they are. There is a different function for vets in a whole range of other ways in terms of veterinary legislation and so on, and an awful lot of the work that needs to be done either by authorised officers, if they are vets, or other authorised officers who aren't vets but who will have to call in vets to do detailed work because they're not qualified to do it, will make very clear that distinction. But what we're trying to do in this legislation is decide who is going to be given the power of an authorised officer under the limited powers of authorised officers in terms of inspections, in terms of being able to hand out welfare notices, which is essentially like handing out a yellow card to somebody to say, look, instead of going to court here, clearly you're making some welfare mistakes in relation to the animals that you're responsible for. You can accept a fine and a welfare notice to change that practice, and we'll all avoid going to court. Or if you're concerned that you're being treated unfairly, you can still go to court and not pay the appropriate fine. Which I know is a concern that some farm organisations have, that we'll have non-veterinary personnel going onto a farm, finding a farmer without having the same level of evidence or proof requirement that you would require in court. But the whole point is that we're trying to keep people out of court here, where appropriate, for relatively minor welfare offences that can be corrected quickly. And we would have a warning system that doesn't have the same burden of proof that a court would have. And I think that's a good thing for farmers. If someone calls the department to report a serious welfare case, in their view, I would rather be able to send an authorised officer out, whether they're a vet or a non-vet, to be able to investigate that. And if it's a complex case, well, then we'll call in a vet, obviously, to do that work. But we want to be able to have the flexibility to be able to use our authorised officers in as efficient a way as possible. That's the idea. I certainly am open to trying to improve the wording there to reassure people that the kind of person that is being appointed as a veterinary officer would have, that the Minister would have to have regard for their level of experience and their level of qualification. That we need to ensure that anybody who is putting an animal down because they're in extreme pain as a result of an accident or whatever, that actually that person knows what they're doing. And that we don't have an amateur, trying to put a large animal down and, causing an awful lot more distress both for the animal and everybody else present. That is a totally unacceptable situation. But there are instances where it is very difficult to get a vet on site quickly, and where there may be experienced personnel, either the farmer themselves, someone from a knackery yard, someone from a slaughterhouse, where you may have an animal that may have broken a leg in a slatted shed, or may have fallen through a transportation box, and may have you can have pretty horrific and extreme animal welfare cases when an animal needs to be put down quickly for its own good, and we need to ensure that a competent person can do that. Obviously, we would like that to be a vet, but it's not always possible to get a vet there quickly. And so that's the first issue that we're trying to deal with, ensuring that it doesn't have to be a farmer, it could be anybody else, but when you have an animal in significant distress and pain, that somebody, an authorised officer, can make a judgment call as to that animal being put down, and that the animal can then be put down by someone who's competent to do so. In terms of making that judgment call, I think in the vast majority of circumstances, Deputy, it will involve a vet having an input, either by phone or on site. But if you are, what I'm trying to do here is to allow an authorised officer to make a decision in what can sometimes be an extreme situation, a road traffic accident, and if it's not possible to get a vet on the other end of the phone, and you're talking here in minutes in terms of trying to make a decision, that actually an authorised officer will have the power to make that decision. Now, if we decide that that decision can only be made by the input of a vet, well, then I think there are, although I think it would be rare, because I think, as the Deputy says, by and large you can get a vet on the phone most of the time now. But I do think that that there are instances that we need to ensure that we have a flexibility in legislation to deal with, whereby somebody isn't breaking the law if they decide that an animal should be put down quickly because of whatever set of circumstances that probably I think all of us would be aware of could and may happen at times, whether animals are being transported or in the field or whatever. And, you know, if you can't get a vet on Christmas Day or Easter Sunday or whatever, that an authorised officer can make that decision. We had this discussion in the Shannon as well. You know, my view is that an authorised officer should have the power to be able to make that judgment call, although certainly under the training of authorised officers and under the guidelines for authorised officers, I think we should make it very clear that they should seek the advice of a vet when appropriate. The other point that I wanted to make on the actual legal point that Deputy McNamara has raised with me, we are looking into the property rights issue. I mean, if you have a bull that's worth a couple of €100,000 and they have had an injury for whatever reason, whether that's a fracture or have contracted some disease or whatever. You know, I think there is a valid question here that we don't want somebody coming in and making a decision to actually put that animal down, which would have very significant commercial consequences for the farmer. But we also have to ensure that we have consistent animal welfare legislation as well. What I've agreed to do with our officials is to actually take legal advice on this and to come back to you with that in terms of what the appropriate response is from a property rights point of view. But I mean, ultimately, this is back to the amendment that Deputy O'Keefe spoke to. That you know, should there be an onus to actually legally get veterinary opinion before that decision is taken? I think in the vast majority of cases the answer to that is yes, but I think in certain extreme cases I certainly wouldn't like to see an animal suffering unnecessarily, and it's about trying to get that balance right. And I'll certainly take on board suggestions, but I think the amendment that Deputy O'Keefe spoke to, which I think is 40 to 42, that I think putting in a requirement to get a veterinary input into that decision does introduce a limitation that I think could result in animals suffering unnecessarily, and that's my concern.
McNamara?
Yeah, I would, again, you know, welcome what the Minister said, that in the great majority of cases the advice of a vet will be sought. Sometimes, and I would also acknowledge what the Minister said, that sometimes it simply won't be possible to get the advice of a vet. But, you know, I would say that in rural Ireland these times it's easier to get a vet out than a doctor. I mean, in the middle of the night or at weekends, you call a vet. In my experience, they come, you call a doctor, and you're put on an answering machine and probably find you. It's the horrible reality.
I'm not responsible for doctors, no.
Well, I'm not claiming you are, but
If you work with a fled crisis in the health service.
But I am saying that, you know, I'd ask the Minister, in the interest of, first of all, animal rights, and secondly, farmers' rights, to take legal advice in the matter and to consider introducing an amendment at a later stage that an authorised officer at least have to seek veterinary advice. There will be instances where it's not possible to get advice, but they're, as the Minister pointed out himself, very rare. In the great majority of cases, if you seek veterinary advice, you'll be able to receive the veterinary advice. I would be very, very anxious that I wouldn't be part of a committee which allowed a law to go through where authorised officers with very few qualifications could come onto my farm, those of my neighbours, or indeed any one of the many farmers who sit in this committee, and order the destruction of an animal without my consent, in a case where it was unnecessary. And I think the Minister would want to preclude that possibility. So, I think that it's a very small requirement that somebody seek veterinary advice. You know, if you seek advice and it's not possible to get it, well then, you know, it's not possible and decisions have to be made on the spot. But to seek advice, so maybe the Minister would take legal advice on that.
Yeah, well, okay. I do think that there is something in the onus to seek advice. Like my fear, to be perfectly honest with you, is, I mean, if you have a cattle truck that's involved in a crash, and you have and you have to make decisions quickly on putting down animals that have lost limbs, that have, you know, actually, I've seen that happen. I've been on a train when we've run into a herd of cattle, right? And you have a horrific situation where animals need to be put down quickly, and you know, you really don't. Now, of course, you have to have an authorised officer, or you have to have somebody competent to be able to put them down, right? But I just don't want a situation where, you know, in a couple of months or a couple of years' time, like we're hearing somebody saying, well, look, we actually couldn't put animals down because we couldn't get a vet on the end of the line for half an hour or for 40 minutes or for whatever. And like, there's no, like, the intention here is in no way to try and downgrade the advice of vets, like quite the opposite. So maybe we should look at something around, you know, authorised officers having to seek the advice of a vet, and if they can't get it, then they can explain that they couldn't have got the advice and they had to make a decision. Maybe so be it. That's not something I have a problem with, and maybe we look at that.
In view of the minister's undertaking to consider whether or not, you know, a requirement to seek legal advice be considered, I won't be pressing amendments 42 and 43.